Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Hale, and I want to welcome you to SEDE 7335. We're going to talk about adolescent poetry interests for just a little bit. So when we think about adolescents and their poetry interests and how we traditionally teach poetry, we have traditionally taught teenagers how to read texts, but we don't necessarily teach them how to read poetry. And that's because in general, we tend not to be a country of poetry readers. Um, Ironically, we give students poetry and we ask them to get meaning out of it, and it's not as easy as it seems. So I want you to think about, how do you personally get meaning out of a poem? How we get meaning out of a poem, as well as other texts, isn't always something that we share with our students. We don't do a great job of making our thinking visible. What we know is that poetry is a natural form of expression for human beings, because as human beings, we love rhythm. We're hardwired for rhythm. We begin hearing rhythm even before we're born. And because of that, we are rhythmical creatures. So poetry is a natural fit. We also know that as human beings, we are much more poetic. Poetry was around long before prose was around. So poetry comes more naturally to us, and we need to find ways to share that with kids. So we also know that American poets have a hard time supporting themselves by writing poetry, because, like I said, as Americans, we don't tend to read much poetry. Think about for yourself, when was the last time you read some poetry for pleasure? Not because you were preparing a lesson, but because you just wanted to read some poetry. But at the same time, poetry offers so much to our students for very little time. So when we think about kids and poetry, and how sometimes it has a lack of appeal for our students, sometimes that comes from the teachers. A lot of times teachers have a negative attitude toward poetry. Think about yourself and your colleagues. How do you feel about poetry? If you have a negative attitude about it, where does that come from? We know a lot of times if teachers can avoid teaching poetry, they will. And it tends to be the stepchild of what we know as young adult literature. When we think about poetry, we know that poetry demands a total response from the reader. When you're reading poetry, it's very different from watching television. It's also very different from, say, reading a newspaper or reading a story. Poetry makes you meet it halfway. If you think about poems, there's an economy of words that poets have to subscribe to. So it requires more effort on the part of the reader. You really have to work to understand what the poet is trying to say in those few words. So when we think about what teens think about poetry and why they dislike poetry, here's some reasons why they tend to not like poetry. First off, kids tend to think that all poems have a hidden meaning. They tend to think that all poems are just a spontaneous creation. They tend to think that all poems deal with what we would call poetic subjects, like trees, flowers, other things in nature, love. They tend to think that all poems have a pronounced rhythm that you can beat or tap out with a pencil or with your hand. They think that all poems have an obvious rhyme scheme, and they think that poems are queer, strange, weird, foolish, silly. So where do you think teens get these ideas? Why are these some of the things that they think about poems? Could it be that they think this because this is what they've heard sometimes from their teachers, or their teachers are only sharing poems that fit within these parameters? It could be that that's where they're getting them. So when we think about some principles, some basic best practices for teaching poetry to adolescents, one thing we know is that the teacher has to be a reader of poetry. Okay, so just like if you're going to teach reading, you need to be a reader. If you're going to teach poetry, you need to read poetry. If you don't read poetry, it's going to show, and you're not going to have any enthusiasm for it, which is going to have a negative impact on your kids. We know that the teacher of poetry needs to teach poems about which they are enthusiastic. Don't teach kids a poem that you don't like. It's going to have a negative impact. And we also know that the teacher needs to keep the experience with poetry itself at the center of the teaching. And this slide references a study by I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards conducted a study in England at some of the best universities in England with English majors, and showed them different poems without the author's name, and then asked the students to tell him, is it a good poem and what's it about? And what this study showed was that without knowing the author of the poem, the students couldn't answer those questions. So what that told him was that we're teaching poets rather than poems. Okay, so we have to keep poetry itself at the center of the teaching. We know that teachers need to teach the mechanics of poetry inductively, teach them about the craft of writing poetry, as opposed to teaching the different elements and mechanics of poetry in isolated drill and kill lessons. We need to stop over-explaining poems as teachers. Instead, we need to let our kids discuss poems. What Britton says is that learning floats on a sea of talk, and we need to let that talk occur in our classrooms. Something else we know is that if at all possible, we need to avoid teaching poetry as a unit, or even as a unit at the end of the year after the test. It's way more powerful to take poetry and spread it out through the entire school year. Poetry doesn't need to be taught as a unit. Kids need to experience poetry on a daily and weekly basis. Kids need to be given time to choose poetry that they want to read. They need to have some time to immerse themselves in poetry of their own choosing. And we also know that students who are asked to read and study poetry, they should sometimes be asked to write poetry. As they consume lots of examples of poetry, we need to give them the opportunities to produce their own poetry as well. A couple of studies I want to share with you. The first one was conducted by Ann Terry, and this was a major study in the field. It focused on 5th and 6th graders. And what Terry found was that students' most favored type of poem was the limerick. But they also indicated in her study that they liked narrative poems, or poems that tell a story. Their very favorite poem was a poem called Mummy Slept Late and Daddy Fixed Breakfast by John Ciardi. So a little bit later, a few years later, a scholar named Karen Kudiper replicated Ann Terry's study, and in her study, in Kudiper's study, she focused on grades 7 through 9. She took the top 10 poems that were used in Terry's study and used those, and then she reached out to professors of adolescent literature around the country, as well as poets in the field, for other recommended poems. So she compiled this list of poems and replicated Terry's study with 7th through 9th graders. The only poem that showed up in the top 10 in both studies was that narrative poem, Mummy Slept Late and Daddy Fixed Breakfast by John Ciardi. Some of the findings and the instructional implications from these two studies. We found that junior high or middle school kids like poems with rhyme, rhythm, humor, and that are easy to understand. If you think about junior high kids, these things are right up their alley: rhythm, rhyme, and humor. They liked funny poems that were read out loud, like those limericks. Kids love to hear limericks read out loud. Kids indicated in their responses that if it was a serious poem, it received the highest marks or ratings from the students if they were just asked to read it on their own. Okay? They didn't want the teacher over-explaining it. They didn't want there to be a lot of baggage associated with the poem. They wanted the chance to read the poem on their own. The poems in the study that received the lowest ratings were poems where the kids had to follow along with the poem while listening to it being read aloud. Okay, that's a big implication. So we need to really think about that one and how that impacts our teaching. So let's talk about some significant poets and poetry books in contemporary adolescent literature. So Paul Janesco, uh, major poet in the field of young adult poetry. He not only writes his own poems, but he also has put together a lot of different anthologies of poetry for teenagers. He was a featured speaker at the TCT-ELA conference a couple of years ago. I'm changing this PowerPoint so it says in years past. Some of his books include Stone Bench in an Empty Park, which that's his original poetry. It's a series of haiku. He's written A Kick in the Head, Poke in the Eye. Those are both collections of different kinds of poems. He wrote The Death of the Hat, which is kind of the history of poetry. So that one, again, is a collection of other people's poems tracing the evolution of poetry. Reflections on a Gift of Watermelon Pickle. This is a collection that changed the face of young adult poetry. Poetry written for adolescents began to look different after this particular book came out. And this is one that I have seen be part of different textbook adoptions in the state of Texas. A poet named Mel Glenn, he has a number of poetry books, Class Dismissed, Jump Ball. Before his books came out, we tended to share poetry with adolescents that were not necessarily written for teens. The intended audience was actually adults. And that's true of much of the poetry that we see in today's literature anthologies. But Mel Glenn's books changed that. He was a high school English teacher, so he had a different view of poetry. Some others, Karen Hess, she's the author who wrote Witness and Out of the Dust. Those are both narratives in verse that are also historical fiction. Cool Salsa and Red Hot Salsa. Those are both collections of poems in which the poems appear both in English and in Spanish. Great for the diverse world in which we're living. Here's A Kick in the Head. Again, that's by Paul Janesco. It was that one is kind of an everyday guide to poetic forms. And then here's another book called Poet Speak. This one is aimed at middle and high school English teachers. Kids can read it too, but what I like about this book, it includes the poems as well as essays by the poets. So we get to know the poet and their process a little bit more. Some of the trends that we're seeing in poetry for kids and for teens is taking a classic poem and turning it into a 32-page picture storybook. So for example, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by Robert Frost, that's been turned into a picture book. Beautiful illustrations. His poem Birches, also been turned into a picture book. The Owl and the Pussycat has been turned into a picture storybook. There's lots of classic poems that are coming out in this form. The idea has been that you take a poem, kind of treat it as a story, and then there's an illustrator who works with the words and illustrates it. And one of the things we see is that many times the poets, if they're still alive, tend to prefer more abstract illustrations over those that are more realistic. So it's an interesting trend. So many of the poems that you may be teaching in junior high and high school, it's worth looking around online and seeing if it has been turned into a picture storybook. So that's it for this evening. Continue reading your novels in verse, and we'll be talking about them soon. Have a great night.